the 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
The Negro would appear to stand on a lower evolutionary plane than the white man and to be more closely related to the highest anthropoids. The characteristics are length of arms, a heavy, massive cranium with large arches, flat nose depressed at the base. In one characteristic, the texture of hair, the white man stands in closer relation to the apes than does the Negro.
British historian Arnold Toynbee, author of A Study of History, 1934.
It will be seen when we classify mankind by color. The only race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the black race.
Albert Schweitzer, 1961.
With regard to the Negro, I am your brother, but your elder brother.
But you have to understand, these three men didn't hold isolated opinions. This quote, questioning the need to increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, comes from one of the fathers of our country, Benjamin Franklin. We all know that another founding father, Thomas Jefferson, owned slaves, but he put his feelings about those slaves in writing when he voices his suspicions that blacks are inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind. Unlike Franklin, Jefferson also had a low opinion of Native Americans, claiming they were weak with no family ties. And Abraham Lincoln may have issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but not for reasons of equality. He says while the two races do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And he says he, as much as any other man, is in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Comments such as those have taken place during our lifetime, the lifetime of our parents, and at the very most, the lifetime of our grandparents. It's these type of disparaging remarks that those of African descent have to make a rebuttal against.
The pyramid texts. During this period, we have the world's first philosopher, Ptah Hotep. So in other words, during this period, this was the most amazing period in world history. Now, we could talk about details and so on, but I'm going to keep it real simple. Check him out. I'll just let that sink in. Right, so this is then the beginnings of black history. At this point, there are only two civilizations on Earth. Tarseti, the land of Set, and Kemet, the land of Egypt. Does that make sense? Yeah. There are no civilizations anywhere else. Right, the next great period begins with this guy, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II. Mentuhotep II is responsible for the second unification of Egypt that created what's called the Middle Kingdom. He's one of the pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, and what happens is he banishes his rivals, pulls together the two lands, and was then the next pharaoh to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now the Middle Kingdom is really interesting, because it's during the Middle Kingdom that modern ideology, as we understand modern ideology today, was born. The idea that a government has a responsibility to look after its people, to feed its people, to clothe its people, to build, for example, we get buildings of apartments of 3,000 rooms, we get the draining of swamps, irrigation, all the things that a modern government does. They were dealing with it then. Now, here
all right, let's move forward. Now, with man coming out of this period, we see him going down the Nile, and the reason we're using the Nile as the example in that the oldest records of human behavior, where the man left his record, has been found in that specific area.
Is that this was built something like 3,500 BC. This particular part was built by Pharaoh Senusret I, and as you can see, yeah, I'm feeling that. Right, now, here we have a line of sphinxes. And the sphinxes show Aries the ram. Aries the ram is sacred to the deity Amen. So we're starting off here, which is Karnak. We're going to follow the line of rams. And as we follow the line of rams, this is where we end up. It's a bit like we're starting off here, which is Karnak. We're following the road. We've got this double line of rams till we end up here. Now, essentially, we're moving 2 miles across the city of Karnak / Thebes. This city originally had a population of 1 million people. In 1832, a guy called G.A. Hoskins traveled across Sudan. And when he got there, he saw these pyramids and he sketched them. And he published them in 1832. Now, you see that there's some people in the picture giving us some idea of scale. And what's really interesting about the Sudanese pyramids is that there are 223 pyramids in Sudan. Now, there's 19 in Egypt. Therefore, there are more than twice as many pyramids in Sudan as there are in Egypt. Now, this is the site Nuri, the first of the capitals of Kush. Now, ruling from Nuri, we get a very great king called Pharaoh Taharqa. Some people pronounce it Taharqa. Now, the same person's in the Bible where it's spelled Tirharqa, same person. Now, this particular person reigned between the years 690 BC and 664 BC. He's actually the most powerful black ruler in history. Unlike all previous rulers who called themselves Pharaoh of the Two Lands or Pharaoh of Kush, he crowned himself the Emperor of the world. Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan, his book is called Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. Now, the details are wrong, but the sentiment is spot on. And this is where you can tell that Dr. Ben Yochanan has done more reading than everybody else. You can tell. Now, the empire of the Ethiopians wasn't this territory. Where the empire begins, it begins in Sudan. It includes Egypt. It went all the way to Carthage, all the way to Morocco, all the way to Spain. That makes sense? And then on this side, yes, it certainly went into Syria. So in other words, Pharaoh Taharqa ruled 1/3 of Africa. Right, now I did some special research on this, so let me share some of this. There's some controversy in white circles over whether or not this is genuinely Hannibal, right? Right, so if anyone challenges you on this, this is what you're supposed to say. The documents tell us one fact about Hannibal. He rode the sole surviving Indian elephant. So that's what we're looking for. What kind of elephant is this? It's an Indian elephant. African elephants have a different shaped back. An African elephant's back curves in. The ears are much, much bigger. There's an apron hanging underneath the legs. Does that make sense? That is an Indian elephant. Now, once we know by Polybius and Livy that my man rode the sole surviving Indian elephant, it's that. Yeah? And if that's one side of the coin, then who's this? There it is. Tin mining operations taking place in Nigeria that was led by the British. These tin mining operations resulted in certain places being dug up. And as places were being dug up, artifacts were being found. And then subsequent diggings found out that there was a civilization whose very beginnings goes back to, wait for it, 4,290 BC. Yes? Now, by the time we get to the period 1000 BC, we're starting to see brilliant art coming out like this. Now, this bust, we need to examine it because there's some very, very important points here. You'll notice here that the eyes almost like triangular, yeah? The mouth here is almost like a cube turned round. You can see similar geometric shapes here. Now, the idea of reducing the shape of a person to actual shapes, geometric shapes. Now, this is what would ordinarily be called modernism. Because this is where the Cubists got the idea from that you could reduce a human being's shape into geometrical shapes. But this is modernism 1000 BC. You understand? Yeah. Meaning that modernist thought, abstract thought, Africans were dealing with this 1000 BC. And then the Europeans caught up with Picasso and Modigliani 100 years ago. Oh, there it is.
If you notice, all these fossils that I was talking about, and this is just a sample of some of them, are located in Africa, mainly in the same place. You know, they all are located with their center around Lake Victoria or Lake Nyanza. And so you'll see that they're in Ethiopia, they're in Tanzania, they're in Uganda, down in Mozambique, and so forth. These are the places, but mostly in Kenya and Tanzania. These are the richest fossil finds. But I'm trying to show that they're tightly packed together in one place, and that's all of the types are generally, you would say that they had their home in the equatorial region of Africa.
I was studying anthropology. I was told there were no mathematical systems in Africa. Because where they were studying in the bush and the desert, people counted with their fingers. Mathematical systems were among developed Africans, which were never studied because the African is not developed. Okay, so that you don't look where you should be looking. So they never found anything. She found mathematical systems where there were complex peoples. People who needed mathematics because they were involved in intensive and extensive trading. And then scripts. I was told the Africans never wrote. That's what I was told in university. We are preliterate, they said. But don't worry, we are giving you scripts. I did not know that the English who were telling me the Africans were preliterate are preliterate also. The English have no script. A lot of people haven't brooded on that. There is no English script. The script you use to use Anglo-Saxon songs is Roman. The English never wrote. When the Romans attacked Britain, they found nobody reading or writing.
An instrument of colonialism, the handmaiden of colonialism. And I can remember as a little boy wanting to teach the junior class in Sunday school. And I began to look into the great book, trying to find my own people, and I didn't see that image nowhere. I tried to find the word Negro, and it wasn't in the Bible. I didn't know there was no such thing as a Negro, you know. And I looked at the Sunday school lesson, look at all these images, and all these images told me that I was nothing. I was outside of everything in the world, and that all the achievement in the world was done by white people.
And so, how could you compare Sumer with Egypt? Ur, Lagash, and those places, those were city-states. They did not have the centralized network, the empire that the Egyptians created. And look at their writing system, the cuneiform tablets, the merchant bills and notes. They did not have the great literature of the Egyptians. Where is their literature compared to the literature of the Egyptians? The thousands of things that we have found even today in spite of the devastation. And look at their architecture. Who could compare the architecture of the Egyptians with the Sumerians? We cannot even reconstruct the Mesopotamian temple when the Egyptian works stand immortal upon the face of the earth. When the Sphinx, when the Great Pyramid was finished and it had its polished limestone casing, they say it was like a star over the earth. You could stand for hundreds of miles and see it shining. What is there in Sumer and in Babylon like that? They say the stone that was involved in the building of the Great Pyramid could build 30 Empire State Buildings. If you were to cut it into 1-foot cubes, it would encircle 2/3 of the belly of this planet. What are they talking about? And you look at all these things, you look at the medical documents you find in those Edwin Smith papyri, helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis. many things, studies of the pulse, studies in diagnostic percussion, fractures of the clavicle, dislocation in the mandible. Word for word, Hippocrates takes out the fractures of the clavicle and dislocation of the mandible and puts it in his work. And he's the father of medicine. We just have to be very careful, and this is something that happens in all movements, not to claim that everything is black. That is not necessary. The contributions of the black to the world are so great in terms of what we know now that it is not necessary to claim things that are not necessarily true. In the field of medicine, for example, they have found incredible things. They found vaccines among Africans long before Edwin Jenner. They found the smallpox vaccine had been brought to this country by Onesimus, a slave of Cotton Mather. They found that the Africans were using aspirin long before the Western nations, that the Bantu were using Salix capensis, which yields salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They found the Africans had made breakthroughs in eye cataract surgery in the 13th century. Africans were performing eye cataract surgery in the Empire of Mali, in the city of Djenné. Nobody in the world was performing eye cataract surgery at the time. And there were certain surgeries in Africa which taught surgeries which had a profound effect on surgery in Europe. In the 1870s, whenever the cesarean operation was performed, the cesarean section was performed in women, the woman invariably died in Europe. Because of the British Empire, the British learned that Africans were performing the cesarean successfully. A team under Dr. Felkin went out to East Africa among the Banyoro surgeons to study how they were performing this operation. They noted, please note, that the Africans had developed their own anesthetics and their own antiseptics. Antiseptics had only been introduced in an European operating theater by Lister 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation. Many doctors in Europe did not know, as late as the 1870s, that even if you perform a successful operation, your hands, the poison in your fingertips will kill the patient. They did not have proper antiseptics. They washed their hands in water. They found the Africans were using sterile antiseptics. They saw how they cut. They saw how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They saw how they took the baby out. They saw how they were able to take the cautery iron and stop internal bleeding almost instantly with minor tissue damage. They saw how the Africans stitched. They drew the stitches. They brought it back to Europe. And the cesarean operation after that was performed with far greater success. Nobody knows, unless you study the history of medicine, that that was what happened.
Historian, and those who became Western by virtue of commingling with them. I have to look at Delphi, the Greek first center of learning, and ask who built it and where did the information for it came from. I got to look at the first. Let us look at the first recorded Greek. And we can't go any further than Homer. We can't go any further than Homer's writing. I want you black Greeks to dig this. Homer, the first Greek writer, was writing. It was not until 883. Greece, Egypt had almost died by then. Ethiopia had gone by then. Ta-Nehisi, which you now call Sudan, had been gone by then. And even then, the Greek writer that you follow, Homer, said, even the gods Zeus and Apollo came from Ethiopia. And they weren't speaking about the geographical piece of land that was cut up at the Berlin Conference in 1884-86 and given to an African people and said, that's your outline, that's going to be your homeland. They were speaking about what the Greeks at the time was calling the continent, what they knew of it. And what they knew of it stopped at the Sahara. And they knew nothing south of there. That's why they drew the map of Africa as a rectangular, stopping at the southern end of the Sahara. As late as 200 BC, Eratosthenes drew his map of Africa in that shape.
Egypt until 640. The first non-African people came to Egypt, otherwise called the Hyksos, in 1675 BC. The Africans there were already in the 13th dynasty period. They had built every pyramid you saw there before. They had done the S-turn in the Nile. They built every one of the major temples that had already been built, including the Grand Lodge of Luxor. The first European to come there did not arrive until the Greeks arrived with Alexander II, the son of Philip of Macedonia.
Look, I'm a college graduate. I never heard all this stuff before.
Because they didn't intend to teach you that. They can't tell you that you're inferior and teach you that you taught Europe. The first Europeans to be civilized by the Africans were the Greeks. When you heard of Homer, the first European to have written anything, you couldn't miss that. They said that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that was not until 833 BC. The Africans had already, in 255,000 at the Tassili Mountain, they had the Sibyllian period, first, second, and third, the pre-dynastic period, all the way up. The Africans had produced men like this, Imhotep, the multi-genius that designed the step pyramid of Saqqara, the first man to be a physician that even Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, is giving him credit and call him the god of medicine. The Greeks changed his name from Imhotep to Aesculapius. There he is. There he is.
Wait a minute.
With that advance in the pulse 1,000 years later, Egyptians had books, diagnostic percussion, studies of circulation, studies of the pulse. They had chapters that were taken by the Europeans, the Greeks, and copied word for word. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, the Greek, copied studies and fractures of the clavicle and dislocation of the mandible, copied word for word. The medical school of Kos in Europe, in Greece, was an imitation of the medical schools in Egypt. Every scholar, St. Clement of Alexandria, said that if you were to write a book of 1,000 pages, it would not be enough to put the names of Greek scholars who went to study in Africa. That was the big thing, as today in shattered Africa, Africans have to go to Europe to study. In those days, Europeans flocked to Africa to study because there was nothing much to study in Europe. Their astronomy was transformed by the Africans. They did not know how to shape the year. They had primitive, inadequate calendars. Egypt gave us the world's first accurate calendar, the 365 and a quarter day year. They created Christmas, not Europe. It's Africa created Christmas. Egypt, the word Christ is an African word, K-R-S-T, Christo, Christ. Then it was translated into Greek, Christos. It's not European. Europeans did not embrace Christ. That was to come much later. There are several books written by Jews that make Christ out to be an ethne. He was profoundly affected by the Egyptians because he spent his boyhood in Egypt. He was smuggled into a village called Marathia near Heliopolis. He spent his boyhood in Egypt. When you first see him in the Bible, when you first see him in the books by his disciples, they're first aware of him at the age of 12 when he's talking to the doctors. Egyptian doctors, what doctors do you think they are? There's a far cry between Muhammad and some of these people who call themselves Muslims. There's a far cry between Jesus the Christ and some of these people who call themselves Christians, who in the name of Jesus practically enslaved half the world. What's Christian about Europe? Everything they did to Africans and people of African descent was unchristian. European. But note, even at the time of the conversion, who do you think was the Pope? When Constantine, the Roman emperor, was converted, the Pope was a black man. You will see his picture in the slides. Miltiades, the black Pope of Rome. Or rather the black Christian Pope, because Rome later became the seat. of the papacy, but the black pope was a black man, Miltiades, 312 to 314 AD.
To organize thuggery is not to civilize a people. Now, when we look at the history of the intelligence of Europe and its war on our community, we can trace European intelligence from the discovery of a book called The Odyssey and the Iliad, written by someone named Homer, who we don't even know whether he's man or woman. To this day, they began with a lot of mythology about Africa. Complementary mythology, but strange and confusing. The African was 10 feet tall with one eye in the middle. It's a complementary, but misleading mythology. It began with the Greeks. Anytime they want to get people off their backs, said, no, I'm going to call on my friends, the Ethiopians, leave me alone. Why did they turn to Africa as a symbol of strength when they were just beginning to discover intelligence? Now let's look at 850 BC. Egypt had already had 10,000 years walking the sun and was tired. 100 years later, Egypt's relatives from the south would move up, Castor, Pianki, Taharqa, starting in 751 BC. These relatives from the south, from the 25th dynasty, would show the people in the country that the Greeks called Egypt how to rule a nation one more time. Don't count any dynasties after the 25th. Because all the other dynasties was mixed breed, mulatto size, foreign eyes, and confused. Ending with Cleopatra. Where was Europe learning to crawl while the Africans were walking in the sun?
I was with my wife in Egypt last summer and we went to Aswan. And I looked at a block, an obelisk, a stone obelisk which had been cut many centuries ago. And I looked at the way it had been cut, the perfection of the cut. I looked at the stone. And I wondered why they had abandoned this obelisk. They abandoned it, they said, because it had a flaw. And I looked carefully. It is true, my eyes are not what they used to be. I could not see this flaw, so I used my hands, which are extremely sensitive. And it had to be pointed out to me where the flaw was, and it was very clear to me it would have taken centuries for that flaw to really make a difference. But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. When the Japanese were building the pyramid, when they tried to put the stones in alignment, they cracked and broke and were badly scratched. When they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment, 1/1000th of an inch accurate, not a single stone was scratched or cracked. You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
Want to see the proof? Want to get that power? The power's in the knowledge, but it only comes to you when you know what your ancestors did, because only then do you know what you can do. The power's in the knowledge,